Hi everyone, and welcome to our two-part video which is going to be covering the topic of imagery. Now, this video is relevant to students in the Language Studies unit and is particularly aimed at Year 11 English ESL students. So in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at a number of different ways to understand what imagery is and how it's used in texts. So firstly, we'll be looking at what is imagery. Secondly, how imagery is used in prose, and we're going to be looking at two examples to identify imagery in prose. And then thirdly, how imagery is used in poetry, and looking at two examples of how to identify imagery there. So we're really going to be looking at imagery in a number of different contexts, and then really usefully applying that to real life texts so that you can see the way that you would analyze a text if you had a similar situation. So, let's start by looking at what imagery is. Now, we've already looked at a glossary of language techniques, and imagery is basically all of those techniques put together. Imagery is a grouping word for any words or techniques which make you see a picture in your mind when you read them or hear them. The image can be realistic or fantasy-based. Descriptive language is important when creating an interesting text. So as you've seen from studying text so far, and as you've seen from your own creative writing, text can be really quite bland and boring if they don't have that descriptive, interesting imagery in it. So the way the texts are made interesting and exciting really is through adding this level of imagery to really make sure that the readers are engaged and are interested in the work that they're reading. So, let's look at using imagery in prose to start off with. We've already looked at a glossary of language techniques for those sorts of techniques which you can identify and use yourself. We now are going to apply these to classic texts. So you'll find that there's a real difference between understanding what a technique means, and thinking you understand it theoretically, and actually applying that to real life English. So that's what we're going to be doing in this video. Common techniques that we'll be looking at are going to include things like similes and metaphors, onomatopoeia, hyperbole, and personification. These are those very classic techniques which authors do like to use and that you will see consistently in these texts. So let's start by looking at the novel Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Now, Great Expectations is a classic English novel written in 1850. It depicts the life of Pip, who's an orphan boy living in Victorian England. This scene, which we're going to be looking at, is a description of Miss Havisham, who's a wealthy spinster who decides to take Pip on, off the streets and to give him a chance in life. So we'll see the way that Miss Havisham is described and how imagery is used to set her up as a character. So, let's look at this extract. She was dressed in rich materials, satins and lace and silks, all of white. Her shoes were white, and she had a very long white veil dependent from her hair, and she had bridal flowers in her hair, but her hair was white. Some bright jewels sparkled on her neck and on her hands, and some other jewels lay sparkling on the table. So the first technique, which you'll see highlighted here, is the list technique. Now, this is used to show the immense wealth that Miss Havisham has and the very decadent scene which you're seeing. So these fabrics, the rich materials, satins, lace, silks, and later on the bright jewels, really show the connotations of being nice to feel and to touch and to look at. These are all very valuable things. Now you're highlighted, all of white, her shoes were white, a long white veil, her hair was white. This is the repetition of the word white. Now, this imagery is suggestive of the colour of brides and also of purity. However, later on, when we look at this extract a little bit further, you'll see that white slowly turns to yellow as the passage continues, and this is suggestive of her deterioration in old age and that process that humans undertake. So if we continue with this extract, she had not quite finished dressing, for she had but one shoe on. The other was on the table near her hand. Her veil was but half arranged, her watch and chain were not put on, and with her handkerchief and gloves and some flowers and a prayer book, all confusedly heaped about the looking glass. So this listing technique really shows that the image is half complete. The character isn't totally dressed, and you're getting this sense of everything being in disarray and being very confused. So that image is being very well built up throughout this passage. Words such as half and not show the negative flip side to the beautiful image. You know, this image isn't completely there, and it's not quite right because it hasn't been finished yet. The scene seems moth-eaten and spoiled. Things aren't as they seem. We can just continue on with the passage. I saw that the bride within the bridal dress had withered the dress, and like the flowers, and had no brightness left but the brightness of her sunken eyes. I saw that the dress had been put upon the rounded figure of a young woman, and that the figure upon it, which now hung loose, had shrunk to skin and bone. Once I had been taken to see a ghastly waxwork at the fair. So here we get the juxtaposition between this wedding scene in the present, so the old woman, and in the past, the young woman when she was actually getting married. So that juxtaposition here is extremely important. You'll see highlighted here the first person of I saw that, which really shows the emotional involvement of the scene and gives an indication of the fact that this is really a personal and painful reflection of the narrator. So perspective is really an important aspect which adds to imagery. The white imagery, additionally, that we discussed earlier, is contrasted to this harsh reality of the old woman who's withered and thin. She's not round anymore. She's withered and, like the flowers, has no brightness left. So we get that sense that as an old woman, she's really deteriorated. And that juxtaposition is very powerful in highlighting that. At the end, we finally get an extension of this imagery through memory and flashback. So the idea of the ghastly waxwork at the fair, which compares to what now the narrator is seeing. We'll now move on to our second prose text and examine some imagery within that. So this next text is called The Power of One, and it was written by Bryce Courtenay in 1989. The novel is set in South Africa during World War II and the apartheid era. So there's a lot of political issues coming up in this novel. We won't be looking at those right now, we're merely focusing on the imagery, but if you are looking for a related text, this is definitely an extremely recommended one. The book tells the story of an Anglo-African boy who was raised by his Zulu nanny after his mother has a nervous breakdown. And the book surrounds his dream to be a professional boxer and his desperation to achieve his goals. So this first extract from this book. My life proper started at the age of 5, when my mother had her nervous breakdown. I was torn from my black nanny with her big white smile and taken from my grandmother's farm and sent to boarding school. So here the language of recount is highlighted. We very much get a sense that this is a boy reflecting on his life, and he's telling his story at this point from quite a rational perspective. The negative words that are also highlighted, however, are really showing you the narrator's reaction to the events. So the use of these very strong, pervasive verbs, the nervous breakdown, torn, taken, sent, they're all very active, and they're showing that maybe against his will, this boy's life has really been ripped apart. We also get highlighted the very soft imagery. My black nanny with her white smile. Imagery associated with the nanny is a lot more positive. So we get the sense that, this is what he longs for. He longs for this beautiful image of his past rather than the harsh reality of his present. The first 5 years of his life were very easy and pleasant with, the juxtaposition of the black nanny and her big, white, happy smile with this awful, unpleasant, nervous breakdown that's happening in his life at the moment. So as a result of this, the boy is sent to boarding school, and this extract speaks quite powerfully of his unpleasant situation there. Then began a time of yellow wedges of pumpkin, burned black and bitter at the edges, mashed potato with glassy lumps, meat apron with gristle and grey gravy, diced carrots, warm, wet, flatulent cabbage, beds that wet themselves in the morning, and an entirely new sensation called loneliness. Now, here the imagery highlighted is of horrible food. All of this list is really disgusting descriptions of the food that they ate in boarding school. And this really appeals to the reader's sense of taste and makes it realistic and relatable. So as we've discussed in previous videos, a really good way of making imagery work is through making it relatable to all of the senses, not just to the sense of sight. Alliteration of burned black and bitter really shows that very harsh sound and is reflective of his general situation. The personification of the beds that wet themselves also gives the sense that everyone is out to get him. Obviously the beds didn't wet themselves, he wet the bed, but that powerful personification there really gives the indication of his unhappiness and his hostile environment. We finally get the return to the negative imagery of an entirely new sensation called loneliness. And the end on that very profound statement really builds up the image of his unhappiness in his situation. So that brings us to the end of this part of our video. If you join us in just a moment in part 2, we'll be examining poetic imagery and how imagery is perhaps used in different ways in poetry rather than in prose.